Museum. My name is Greg Sandoval. I'm the curator of public programs here, and welcome to today's gallery talk with Sonali Gupta Agarwal. This is a collaboration with the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology, and today begins their open house. So this is the first gallery talk. There'll be another one at 12:35 in Intersections, and then there's also a talk at 1 o'clock in the auditorium and open classrooms throughout the afternoon. So please take a look downstairs at the Institute if you have not visited it before. Sonali is the Director of Public Programs at the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology and a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. She completed her PhD from the Archaeology IDP at UCLA, specializing in Egyptian archaeology, and she also has a law degree. Sonali's approach to archaeology is anthropological, and she's very invested in making archaeology relevant in contemporary times. Her talk here in Enduring Splendor focuses on understanding layers of hidden meanings embedded in silver jewelry from an anthropological perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for giving us this opportunity to showcase, the way archaeologists look at things. And I'm really happy to be here to get this opportunity, especially one, because it's silver jewelry and I love that. And secondly, I'm Indian, so what better way to showcase my culture through the lens of archaeology and anthropology. So without much ado, I would like to take you further back in time to the Bronze Age civilization of the Indus Valley, where we find the first instances of people adorning themselves with jewelry. And we know that they had beads, they strung beads on themselves. You have depictions of men and women and children alike wearing these beautiful beads that were bored very well, and so the technology was very fine as well. And we know that with social complexity, we see this social stratification, and jewelry became a symbol of visually conveying what could not said with words about what their status in society was, what they wanted to convey to the other person. So this really tells us that how back the whole idea of jewelry goes, at least what we see in the Indian subcontinent. And to start with the first case, and I really want you all to think that when we think of jewelry, we think of women. We think of women adorning jewelry. But in the Indian context, in the past, and even today, if you go into rural areas, you find men wearing jewelry as well. So jewelry is not gendered, it is beyond gender. And what better way to portray that non-duality that duality we think of, but what is not really there, is with this image of Shiva, who happens to be my favorite god because he's non-conformist. He lives on the periphery. He's a very indisciplined god, but he has this amazing order that he creates, and everybody worships him. And I worship him, with my heart, because he's so wonderfully exotic as well. Anyway, so Shiva here is depicted with his wife, who is Parvati, and she's an equal. And Shiva was a tribal god. He always treated his wife as an equal, and I really like that about him. And if you see the form, you can see the breast of Parvati and Shiva together coming in unison, and which tells us that it's not about being male and female, it's about being one, and both can wear jewelry and convey ideas that go beyond our understanding of man and woman. And if you see the jewelry that is displayed here, this is a piece from South India. It is done in this work which is called Kundan. Kundan is a technique where gold, which you all know, is very malleable. So it's beaten into pieces, and the gem is just, fixed without glue or anything around it. And the ends are almost shaped like the cobras. So a lot of things that we see in jewelry is also taken from the landscape around. And we find that embedded in the jewelry showcased here. The earrings that you see, they come from the Sanskrit word karn for ear. So karnpul is a form of earring that resembles the flower. And you can also see Shiva wearing his earrings, the girdle he wears to showcase the hip movements, and the anklets that he wears. And all around the gallery, if you see, this exhibit has been beautifully curated because it really provides context and meaning as well. And I will show you the various variants that you'll be able to see from the statues, from the paintings, and the jewelry. And in India, I really have to tell you this. we are not ashamed of buying gold. Gold is not about being vain of, expending money into something. It's an investment. You tell an Indian that the gold prices are going down tomorrow, they won't care. If they're going up, they still won't care. They will buy gold. Gold is something which is treasured. It's a part of the culture. And I'm not too ashamed to say that even growing up, my family accumulated gold. We might have problems in daily life, for cash flow, but gold was always there, and we don't want to part with it. We never want to part with it. Anyway, but I like silver more than gold. So let's go on to the next showcase, and I'll tell you a little bit about gold and silver. What is gold and what is silver? Gold is for the rich, for the elite. And for the for the poor is this metal silver, which represents the moon. Gold represents the sun. So there are two things which are totally opposite, and one tries to emulate the other one, especially the gold. If a gold wearer is trying to wear silver, it's not appealable. But the person who really who has silver is trying to emulate the people who are wearing gold. The nomads of the desert, the Thar desert in India, really looked at the moon, when they went around the landscape. It was a very lunar landscape. The moon was always accompanying them. So they saw that passion that they had in jewelry with something that represented, that the metal that represented that most was silver and not gold. So you see a lot of that. Also, with this painting, it's from the Kangra School of Art, which these schools of art really developed with the Mughal Empire. So the Mughal emperor used to have his seat of power in Delhi, and he started the Mughal School of Art, and we had the schools of art that spread all over North India. And one of them, they had these distinctive painting forms where orange and all these colors really shone bright, and princesses were shown bedecked in jewelry. And if you see this particular one, he is from royalty. You see this ornament that he has on his turban, which you can see right here, the small one. It's called a sar pech. Sar is head, and pech is something that adorns the head. And you have another piece right here, which is much larger. Now the thing is that these ornaments on the head, in the past, they were only worn by gods and goddesses, the crowns. They were never worn by anybody else, except kings and queens who had associations with that particular god or who were reincarnates of that god. But during the Mughal period, right from the 16th or even before that, the 15th century onwards, the Mughal emperor would tell, all under his domain that only certain princesses could wear the sar pech. So there was an order related to that. What clothes they could wear was ordained by the Mughal emperor. You could just not wear anything. It was a form of control, whoever was under their dominion. And if the British knew that, we would not have had so much of bloodshed. Perhaps they would have controlled the princely states with just, controlling what they wore and, what they adorned, and still kept them, alive in their culture and form. We don't have the princely states anymore. They were abolished in 1956, but the traditions that they hold are very sacred to them because they represent a very, very rich cultural history. Also, if you see this particular gemstone, it has 9 gems around it. They represent the 9 planets. So everything right from birth, when a child is born in India, they're born under a zodiac sign. A horoscope is made. Unfortunately, I was not born in India, so I didn't have a horoscope chart. So my relatives were very, very upset with my parents, and they said, how can you allow her to lead her life without a horoscope chart? So as I grew under the pressure of our families, that is often the case, I got my horoscope chart made. And while I was doing my PhD studies under my professor, who's right here, Professor Wendrick, I was, in those phases of being very gloomy, upset, it happens when you're a student. You go through the highs and lows of life, and when it's very real when you're doing your PhD. So I was like, I really need my birthstone now. I need to consult my horoscope. So I got a stone and I put it on, and believe me not, things started getting better after that. Maybe it was just an effect, a psychological effect, but an effect nevertheless. So if you see, these represent the 9 planets, there was an emperor in India in the 16th century called Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. He had his courtiers also, they were 9 in number. So they were very, very, it didn't matter if you were a Hindu or you were a Muslim, the 9 planets were a real thing and everybody followed it, even the gems, and they made you look beautiful. So let's go to the other case here.
So which is your birthstone?
Emerald. But I don't have any more anymore. And the birthstones are according to the time, the seconds, and your even your name. The first letters of your name are taken out from that. So they're very, very serious about it. So in this particular showcase, you have another painting. It represents a folk tale of Dhola and Maru. They were lovers in the desert. And of course, lovers have to be on the camel, striding along the landscape. And after a little while, if you get close to the case, you can carefully see all the jewels that adorn both of them. And you can see some of the jewels here. This is a bazuband. And you could also see, I didn't mention it, the bazuband are the armlets that you have here. And another thing about Indian jewelry that I want to mention is, of course, they look very beautiful. The gems also have this effect, you know, the planetary effect. But also the ear piercings, the nose piercings, the anklets that you wear, all have something to do with pressure points. So the nose piercing especially, when women, you know, are they get into adolescence, they say some pressure points here. Nobody has really investigated it, but I think there should be a good anthropological study on this, that what do these pressure points do? Things that are put right here in the middle, the chakras that we often talk about in yoga, they have all to do with these pressure points. So this earring that you see here, it's also another form of the Karn phool that we saw there, but an elongated version. And you know, when we wear heavy earrings, our earlobes kind of drag down. So as to avoid that, functionally, the jewelers provided this long string that you could just string up in the air so that the weight would not confine itself to the ear. So there was a lot of functionality associated with it. And if you see this particular piece, it's also made in the Kundan technique that I talked about in the case there, where metallic sheets are, the gold metal was beaten up into sheets and then the gem was, you know, fixed into it. This is a Hath phool. Hath means hand and phool means a flower. So when you wear that, your hand actually looks like a flower. And almost all brides and people from the royal family would adorn that. And again, it had to do with pressure points. We often talk about acupuncture, acupressure, and if you see, they kind of align with the pressure points of the human body. So it has a lot to do with that as well. So let's go to the next case. This is my favorite case because two of the pieces here belong to the hill state, which is in the Himalayas. This particular one, it's called a Chandan Har. Again, it talks about the moon because it's silver. It has depictions of peacocks. Now, the thing is, in India, when a person is wearing jewelry, maybe to us they look very similar, very beautiful, but they are demarcated boundaries of what one can wear and what one cannot wear. This particular piece is always worn by Muslim women who lives in the mountains. There is no depiction of a god or a goddess. I've got a similar piece, but I have a goddess on it. So the Gadis in the mountains wear this particular piece. This particular piece is the tikka. It goes like this on the forehead, and it's really gigantic. So the focal point becomes this. And also, as a child grows up, right when children are born, you bedeck them with jewelry. So you put either silver or black, or you put gold and black. So the black represents the pupil of the eye. So it's in order to save the child from the evil eye, which is very common in ancient cultures all over the world. So India is also one of them. They follow suit. But as the child grows, suppose it's a girl child and she's reaching adolescence, so the black and the silver beads are gone. Then you start adorning them with jewelry that entices potential grooms. And you do it in such a subtle way that the child does not even realize that the child has grown up. My mother didn't do that to me, I'm grateful, but in rural areas that is the norm. this terracotta figurine, it comes from 200 CE, but it really represents the terracotta figurines from the Indus Valley. Very similar, things that they adorned. Even if you see this little lump that is right in the front, it represents a picture, a womb of a mother, purest of the pure. Okay, so they're venerated, they're bejeweled, they're bedecked, all of that. And I need to talk about this particular piece for sure. So here, during the Mughal time, we see another form of art that creeps in, which is called Meenakari. Meenakari is a form where they do enamel painting. Now the thing was that oftentimes when you wear this jewelry, you would feel that it's very hard on the skin, on the obverse. So they painted it to smoothen it out and also to avoid the wear and tear of gold. So it really served two purposes, that you're totally beautifying it, not only from the front, but from the back as well. So you're totally invested in the beauty of the ornament, and it is functionally good for the person who's wearing it. And the pearls that you see, they became a norm because they were imported from Basra in Iraq during that period. So all the pearls were imported from there, and the Mughal emperor's family would get these. So only the rich classes would wear this, something like this. And now let's go to this gallery. So here you see the faces of ancient royalty. Like I said earlier, in 1956, the privy purses were abolished for the kings and the queens. You still find their descendants living in forts, living in palaces. And yesterday I had a dear friend of mine who's from a royal family. I called him on FaceTime at around 1 a.m. in the morning, and I didn't want to bother him today. But he has pieces like that, he has swords like this, and I'll show you a few pieces of his wife when we go to that case. And just having them be inheritors of something so rich, which has meaning, which has beauty, must be a great responsibility, because they're transmitting all that information to the next generation. And another thing I want to add, as an archaeologist, in the Indus Valley, we find bodies of the Indus Valley people. They were buried, and at times they were cremated. When they were buried, you could find the jewelry in context. But Hindus are cremated. So the jewelry you do not see, it's recycled and passed on from generation to generation. So by word of mouth is most of the information that we get, all from scriptures or for texts, or you do an anthropological study and you go to villages and you learn about what jewelry means to them. For example, I went to Rajasthan a few years back, and there was this lady who was dressed in a beautiful garment. It was a purplish kind of skirt, and she would always wear this gold, really heavy gold necklace. And I would tell her, why don't others wear skirts like you do? And she would just tell me that, no, they cannot. I am a Rajput. I'm from the warrior class. If they wear it, they'll be ostracized from the village. They cannot do it. It's against the rules. So they're very, very particular about it. Though things are changing in cities, we are becoming, closer globally. So all these things are overriding. But in rural areas, it's still the norm. So if you go to rural areas, be very careful of what you say. Okay, so this particular case, as you can see, this is what is called a nose ring. It's called a nut. Brides, they wear them. Again, it has something to do with the pressure points, and you see this whole layer that goes like this has a functional capacity, like it has a function associated with it. So the weight does not bring your nose down, and nose represents honor. So this really has to be big because it represents the honor of the family. Then you see a few other pieces here. At this point, I do want to show my dear friend from the royal family, his wife wearing the same thing, and it's really beautiful. Just give me a second here. Here it is. So you see, and in the hill state from where they belong, the larger the nose ring is, the better it is. You're really elevated to that level of being very classy, being from the elite class. And there's another one of his great grandmother. I think I've never seen a nose ring as big as this.
Oh God.
Yeah. Wow. That's really big. And again, they were not to wear this on a daily basis. They adorned themselves with these nose rings sporadically when on festivals and things like that. And the filigree work that you see here on this particular nose ring goes to the eastern part of India in Orissa, where filigree work in silver and gold is really known. These are a few pieces from the Rabari tribe. If you see that woman, she's from the Rabari tribe, and she's wearing earrings very much like this, the one here, and in gold here. Now the Rabaris are nomads. They live in the Thar Desert in the western part of India. They have camels, they live in houses like this. And they also take a lot from the landscape of what they represent. So if you see the middle piece here of earrings, it represents the leaf of a tree that is sacred to them. The tree is called the peepal tree, P-I-P-A-L, and the leaf is exactly, it's a heart-shaped leaf, very sacred to Hindus. So the Rabaris also wanted to adorn it to signify their love for nature. This particular piece is a variant of the tikka, the large thing that you put on the forehead. This is a circular version of it, worn by the rich people who had gold, and also it would dangle a little bit, showcasing the beauty of the village damsel who's walking, so the point of attraction becomes right here. So let's go to the other one. Now, you see two pieces here, the silver one and the gold one. Nimbula is the gold one. The lower classes, caste is a real thing in India. The government is trying to eradicate this differentiation. But what happens is that when you go to villages and you try to break tradition, you get ostracized. Even if you want to support something like that, it is very difficult to apply it. It is a very slow process. With 5,000 years of history, it's very difficult to undo a tradition that has been going on. It's almost like it's in our DNA. It's a very sad thing to say, though it keeps traditions alive, it also makes caste discrimination a very real thing. And it's very difficult for people to cross over caste. You are born into a caste. When I was in a village, I'm always asked my surname, and they ask me that to make sure that I'm okay I'm okay to talk to them, to interact with them for fear of being ostracized. And when you're ostracized, it's not simple. They cut away your food supply. You cannot drink water. There are particular wells that you go to drink water. But again, the government is really trying to get over this, and I hope they're successful, but it's going to take time. So this is worn by rich people in the villages, and this might be worn by poor people in the villages. So it also functions as an amulet. So you would have the picture of a god or a goddess and adorn it always close to your heart. The heart is very important. We feel happy from the heart, we feel sad from the heart, and God is, closer to us here. So they kind of wear this to, show their reverence to God. Again, you see these two pieces, they're called haslis. The Rabaris wear them a lot. You will see another piece like that, an armlet, where you can differentiate between the castes and the religion they come from. So there is one with a very phallic symbol on that side. And that's not worn by the Hindu women. It's actually amazing. It's worn by the Muslim women. And you would wonder that Muslims don't really venerate gods and they're wearing a phallic symbol. Well, India is like that. You're always kept in wonder, and you question every activity, everything. It is in conflict, and it's harmonious at the same time. It's just a bundle of confusion and order. And you really have to go and experience it for yourself. For example, even in Egypt, where I have worked for a long time, I once went to the village near Dendara. It's in Middle Egypt. And they go and worship the god Meen, who has a very phallic. He had a very erect phallus, and they worship him. And I would say that you're Muslims, how can you, this is against the principles of Islam. That's what I've heard. They would say, no, but this is our tradition. So you cannot separate tradition from any religion. And this is one thing that we need to understand in any community that we go to. We cannot see things as black and white. There's so many gray areas, and you have to experience it for yourself to know that. This is another piece of jewelry, again, like the bangle that I showed you there. This is in meenakari and kundan work, beautifully enameled, wouldn't hurt, wouldn't give you rashes. It's the real thing. The silver work here, again, is from the tribes in India and the western side. Who said silver jewelry is not beautiful? It's so, so beautiful, as you can see. Here, you can see some rings, anklets. Now, anklets would be a form of binding. We have foot binding in China. In India, when married women get married, they put anklets on them or they put toe rings on them. Again, toe rings on the same pressure points which allow blood circulation. You do not want to have blood clots or thrombosis in your lifetime, so it helps in blood circulation because your legs really hold your body all day. Plus, they look very beautiful. You see these village women walking with, pots on their head, going to the river to get water with anklets dangling on their feet, with bangles all over and jingle jangle. It's a beautiful scene. It looks like it's from a fairy tale. But you go there and you see the kind of hard work these women do. So a lot of forms of that, they're really bulky and they're really beautiful. Some other forms of armlets are here. They're called the bazu band. The word bazu also shows syncretism. When the Arabs came to India, there was, fusion of language and culture. So the bazu is a word, an Arabic word for the arm. So you see them in silver here with these tassels down here. And here is that piece. Okay. Remember I told you that when people live in certain landscapes, a lot of what they see is also embellished in the jewelry they adorn. So if you see this thorny armlets right here, in the Thar Desert, you've got these thorny bushes. So even these represent those thorny bushes. And also when women walk, you don't want your arm to be held. You say, oh my God, what a gorgeous bangle she's wearing. I want her arm, and you would just go for her arm. But if you see such thorns protruding, you say, no, she's dangerous. That kind of a thing. And another thing I would like to tell you, that in India, till about 2008, women could not inherit property. Then the Supreme Court came into the picture and they said, women should be able to inherit property from their fathers. Now the reasoning before this of the previous judges was that women get what is called Stri Dhan, the wealth of the women, that comes with them when they get married. So they get economic wealth from their parents, and when they get married into a family, they are bedecked with jewelry. There are two purposes for that. One, when a woman goes into a new family, she's trying to say, you know what, I'm a force to reckon with. Look at my wealth. I may be new to your family, but do not mess with me. I have my money with me. That kind of a thing. But of course, there have been many issues relating to that. We had dowry, people would demand dowry. That has really declined. In villages, it's still there. But it's the government, like I said, is really helping in order to eliminate such traditions which really put women down. So it's really a good thing that the government is trying to do now, with women being able to have access to property, access to wealth. The divorce rates are also going up, which is not very good, but women are becoming very independent and conscious about their rights. So what I feel is that traditions should be followed, but they should be meaningful. If they have no meaning and they kind of put one gender down, you should eliminate them altogether, because we have to continue and keep changing as well. So another form of the Hathpool here is in silver. The one that you saw there was in gold. There are some bangles here. There's a beautiful depiction of the Bronze Age girl in the Indus Valley civilization who wears bangles all over. Initially, the women of the Thar Desert, and you will see one of the showcases there. Let's go there. So she's wearing these bangles. Earlier, they would be made of ivory. Now, ivory is banned. People have started making plastic. So we also have to see that as we are changing and continuing with traditions, we also have to see we need to make things that are biodegradable as well, but look beautiful as well. So the whole idea of the bangles, you know, you saw the silver ones which come till here. You see that trend usually in the desert region, and it really looks, makes your arms look very beautiful. She's a bride. In India, women wear red when they get married. White is for widows. Widows are not allowed to wear jewelry. Also, when women get married, they wear the Mangal Sutra, which is called the auspicious thread. Now, when they wear it, in India, whenever jewelry is put on you on certain occasions, it's an abrupt change. When I got married and my husband put that thread, auspicious thread on me, in that one moment, fraction of a second, from an unmarried girl, I became a married woman. I became an aunt. I became so many other things. In the West, the union of man and woman is the focus. But in India, the family becomes the focus. It's a union of two families. It's a great pressure to withstand, but we withstand it. And we're still functioning, you know, functioning, adapting, but it's all there. So you see her, she's wearing the nimbura, she's wearing the amulet kind of protective element here. I would say she might be from the middle class because she's wearing gold and silver, or maybe she just likes silver, like me. So, yeah, and I think she's a Rajasthani bride from the West. If you see the paisley that is there, it's a typical design of Rajasthan. You can see 3 more women right here, bedecked in jewels with the borla, with the nimbura, and all the bangles. So this is, in a sense, what my talk is about. Last Saturday, I met up with the jeweler of some of the pieces that you see here, and I wanted to go around with him and just ask him about the techniques. And for him, just interacting with him, I realized that he was just not a jeweler. He was the bearer of a tradition, of a rich tradition imbued with meaning, with life. He gives life to these ornaments. The relationship of people who buy jewelry from them is just not that one fine day you go to a shopkeeper and you buy jewelry. It's a tradition that goes back many centuries. It's a tradition that holds your culture, your heritage. And when I say that people in India love gold, it's not about being vain. It's about being culturally, you know, there. So I hope you all took something from this lecture. You saw jewelry in a different way. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I would be very happy to answer. And it's almost 12:35. We have Professor Vendrick's lecture in the Intersections Gallery. So you can ask me questions and then we can proceed there. Yeah, yes.
Is there a place for jewelry for men?
For men, of course, the same jewelers. And also, when the Mughal emperors would have these jewelers go to their queen's harem, they wouldn't be scared at all that a male is going into their harem. They trusted them so much. The women would never work, they would never craft the jewelry, but they would string the jewelry. So they had a role to play to beautify it in the end, but the jewelry craft itself was just with the males. They worship a god. They're very serious about worshipping. If you see the jeweler there and you see the documentaries associated with them, they go to their altar every day, take the blessings from the god, and if things don't work right, they need to do something about it. It's very real for them. And they want their children to continue the craft. Many are leaving it because they find better opportunities in computer science. But I hope, I was asking B.D. Soni, I said, what about your children? He says, no, I want them to learn the craft and be, street smart as well. So they will get an education, but they will do this. Why? He said, well, they need to respect me as well. So it's about respect, it's about tradition, it's about transmission. So, yes.
The silver necklaces that the Robaris wear, the ones that are kind of coiled, is there a symbolic meaning to that shape?
So I wouldn't know what exact meaning they have, but I do know that the ones that they wear and the ones that the other tribes wear are very different. So I think they are symbolic signifiers of where they belong.
Just identity?
Identity is very, very strong in these areas. If I would wear a Robari necklace and go there, they would treat me with humor. They would laugh. They would say, oh, you're trying to be us? Good luck. Yeah.
What is their religion?
Their religion, some are Muslims and some are Hindus. So the ones who are Muslims, they wear these, thick blocked ones, and the ones who are Hindus do not wear the blocked ones. So they have this distinction. Even the men, they wear these, things on the ear. So on what ear they wear and how they wear it also shows distinction. Yeah.
But they get along with each other?
Yes, they get along
Even though
well.
they're both Muslim?
Yes, they do.
That's
I think the conflict between Hindus and Muslims is a political one more than anything else. So yeah, there's a lot more to that. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times how the government is striving to change the traditions of differentiation and castes and such. By what means are they?
So they're reserving
Doing that.
seats for minorities in government and important places. So, they're trying to counter it with people who are wealthy and meritorious as well. They reserve seats so that they don't have to struggle. They bring them to that level of getting there. So a lot of reservation is being done. They go to these places, they give them funds, help them get educated. So it's happening at the grassroots level. But again, it's a slow process. And class affiliations are very strong in India. Like a small place in India where, suppose a woman is getting married to somebody else from another caste, they have honor killings as well. And that's where the law of the land comes in conflict with customary law. So, yeah.
In the same subject as you were just speaking about, what is the difference in population between this lower class and the rest of the Hindu population?
I wouldn't know, the Hindus are in majority,
But-
but the caste is really, I wouldn't know the statistics of that, but there are many in rural areas, and they're all
Would you say
confined
they're
to
like
the
a
caste.
fourth of the population or a third of the
A third
population?
of the population. But there are many castes, right? There's subcastes as
Ah,
well.
I
So
see.
I wouldn't be able to give you a real figure. But I do suggest let's go to the next gallery so that we are not late for Dr. Vendrick's talk. And I can answer your questions after the talks as well.